everybody, Dave Thomas here once again, and today I'm going to be building the Super Chief II model rocket produced by Rocketarium. This is a scale model of a sounding rocket. It is a two-stage model, and it uses gap staging along with both 24mm and 18mm motors. So this is going to be a little bit more challenging kit, and I would not recommend this for beginners. As usual, when we start in on a new rocket, we want to check and make sure that we have all the parts. And so we have a parts list here in the back of the instructions. And these first several items here are all part of the decal set, and they're wrapped in tissue paper here. I'm just going to, for the moment, assume they're all there. And then many of these are subdivided into parts bags and such, but we'll just go on down here. And so we've got the parachute next on our list. Okay, two sets of fins here, one for the sustainer and one for the booster. All right, we have several body tubes here. So the largest one will be the main body tube for the sustainer. A smaller one here will go on top of the sustainer and will contain the ejection baffle and the parachute. And then the kind of medium-sized tube here will be for the booster stage. All right, we have a coupler here, which will be for the booster. And a nose cone, which I do have, but I left in another room here. But rest assured, we do have the nose cone. And then we've got the motor tube here. Okay, so this is going to be for the booster section, and this will help ensure that it gap stages properly. And if you've not heard about gap staging before, we'll talk about it more when we build the booster. All right, and then it also comes with this small balsa stick here. This will be used for putting in glue and such. And be careful when you open the box. If you don't find this, it may have fallen out. This was the first thing that fell out of the box of my kit. Going on down, then we have this small parts bag here, and this contains the shock cord, the launch lugs, these two not quite square flat pieces of balsa. These will be hatches as part of the detailing, and then there are also two standoffs here. Okay, then we have the motor mount for the booster, and this contains everything here, and I can see that it's all there. One thing in particular, this orange piece here, this is an adapter spacer so that you can run D-size engines or E-size engines in this. So don't lose this, you'll need it for launching. All right, then there's also the 18mm parts bag, and that is everything shown here. I've already opened this up so I could check something. And then the other part here is the Baffle Kit. And this does not show on the main instructions, but is included in part of the assembly instructions. But this will be to make the ejection baffle, and it has its own instructions inside as well. So it looks like we have everything here, and when we come back we will start assembly. If you're building this kit, I assume you've already built several kits before and have all of the standard types of tools and accessories, so a hobby knife, pencil, rulers, sandpaper, glues, and such. And we're going to start first of all with the sustainer motor mount. And so here's the tube itself. This is a spacer that we'll use to properly place the engine block, and then we have two plywood centering rings and an engine clip. Now the manufacturer told me specifically that you really need to follow this directly. With a lot of motor mounts you can kind of assemble them in any order, but in this case if you get the order wrong here, certain parts may not fit. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my ruler here And I'm going to measure here the 1 1/4 inches from the aft end. Okay. So that's going to be right here. And this is where the aft centering ring is going to go. And so I'm just going to mark on this that this is the aft end. Just put an A here. Okay. And then we want a thick ring of glue exactly 3/4 inside any end. Well, since we already marked this as the aft, it needs to go in the forward end. And so that's why we have the little balsa applicator. I'm going to use this. This is just a little smaller wooden one that I have handy. And the idea here is that we are going to put glue in. This will be the glue for the engine block. Okay, so I'm going to put that right in here. Okay, and I'm erring on the side of too much forward because it won't hurt anything. Okay, and so now what we're going to do is place the engine block into the aft end, and this spacer is going to go all the way up. Okay, so if you've built other kits that use these types of spacers, they'll have you stop like about there. We're going to push this all the way up until it's flush. In fact, we can just put it down like that. And you can see that it's come up against the glue. And now I'm going to just very quickly remove this so that if there's any glue there, that it does not get glued in. Okay, and it actually looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead. I didn't feel any residual glue on here, so I'm going to put this back in for just a minute. And this will allow me to apply basically a thick fillet here on the forward end of my thrust ring or engine block. And just smooth out the rest of that glue. Now I can take this back out again. Still no glue on it. Good. And I'm going to set this aside and let it dry. While the 18mm mount is drying, we're going to go ahead and start in on the 24mm mount. And this has definite ends to it. So on this end we've got 2 holes in the sides here. And so that's the forward end. And then I've marked the aft end here with an A. And so the first thing they ask us to do in the instructions is to make a mark at 3.5 inches. And this is mainly just so that you know approximately where the glue is going to go. And then we also need a mark at 1/4 inch and at 1 1/4 inches. And these will be for 2 of the ring placement. Okay, so once again here we're going to put glue inside this and then use another spacer here that's in the kit to properly place the thrust ring, which is right here. Okay, so that our mark that we made here, this is where the glue is going to go. And again, you can use the little balsa stick that they send in the kit, or you can use some other applicator. And what I'm going to do here is use my thumb nail to approximate where this glue is going to go. And now I'll just stick this in. And as it butts up against my thumbnail there, that tells me where to smear the glue. Okay, and I'm going to look down in there. You can see the glue. I think we'll need a little bit more, because it is getting spread out a bit. Alright, so once more I'm going to take this, spread it around inside. And now I am going to take the engine block once more. Alright, I'm going to put that in there. And once more, this is going to go flush. So I'm going to slide that all the way in, and I can just feel the glue hit there. Alright, and once again, no glue on the end, so all of our glue is where it should be. Okay, and here, this is going to be a little bit more difficult, but I'm going to go ahead and put some more glue on there as a fillet. Just to reinforce that engine block some more. You can see down in there, just do a little bit more. And it's not going to be pretty, but nobody's going to see it there. And then just to make sure, I'm going to put this in once more to make sure I hadn't moved the engine block. Okay, so everything's good there. And so just like we did with the other one, I'm going to set this aside as well. While the two engine mounts are gluing and drying, I'm going to go ahead and move on to marking the body tubes for the fins and launch lugs. And so this is on the back sheet of the instructions. If you don't want to cut up your instructions, you can just make a copy of this. You can also do this with scissors instead of an X-Acto knife. This just happens to be handy. So with my guide cut out here, I'm going to put this around the aft end of the main body tube. So this is the longest one. And we'll just line all that up and put a piece of masking tape on there just to hold it in place. Okay, and so we're going to have 4 fins and a launch lug here. So first of all, we're just going to mark each point. Okay, I'm going to put a little L on this one so that I know it's a launch lug. And the rest of these are all fins. And I'll just slip that off. And now the fin lines need to go up fairly far, but not the whole length of the tube. And for this, I'm going to use this tube marking guide. If you don't have something like this, a door frame works really well. I just have to find the correct side here. Here we go. All right, so the launch lug line here should go all the way up the length. And the fin lines only need to go up about 1/3 of the way. About like that. Okay, and if we go to the next set of instructions, we'll also do the same thing for the booster tube, and that's the medium-sized one. So here, we're just going to slip this back on. And we will put on the same markings here. And once more, we will put this on our fin marking guide. There we go, the right one. And then the launch lug guide again, this is going to go all the way down. My airframe tubes are marked, but I am still waiting for the engine block glue to dry on both of the engine mounts. And so while I'm waiting for that, I'll go ahead and assemble the ejection baffle here. As I said, this comes in its own little bag, has its own instructions here. And the first thing we need to do is take this screw eye and screw it into the baffle plate here. Now, there's only one plate that has the hole for it, so you can't mix these up. Now what I'm going to do is thread this through just until it comes through the other side. And then once that is done, I'm going to take a little bit of my wood glue here. And I'm just going to put a dab of glue right on there. And this is just to help it lock into place. Alright, so I'm just going to thread that through once more. Okay, and I'm going to go to just to this point. We don't want the threads to completely clear there, or it may have the tendency to get shoved inward. So I've got just a little bit of thread left on the outside part, and on the inside I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit more glue. Just go ahead and dab that all around. And then what we're going to do here is the two plates will insert inside this coupler. They are a bit snug, but that's good. So about like that, and about like this. Okay, and this brings up another good point. As we get to the parts where we're putting things together, always make sure everything dry fits first. That way, if there is a problem, if it's too big or too small, it's easier to fix that before you've glued it in than after. Okay, so now we're just going to take and run some glue all around this edge. And when we put the baffle plate in, that's going to force the glue further inside and should create its own fillet on the inside. And according to the instructions, we want to have this pushed in about 1/16 of an inch, okay, which is about that much. And I'm going to make sure there's no glue on the outside here so we don't accidentally increase the diameter. Now when we're finished here, I will come back and put a fillet all along this as well. But first we'll go ahead and put the other plate in. In the same way here, I'm putting glue right along the edge. And then when I put the baffle plate in, that will force that glue forward. Okay, and once again we want this about 1/16 of an inch in. It's a little deeper, it won't hurt anything. Okay, so that looks pretty even all the way around. And the same thing here. I'm going to let the glue set for just a few minutes and then I'll apply the fillet to the outer sides. I am gluing on my fillet now. I've just let this dry for 5 minutes or so. It doesn't have to be completely dry, just enough to set everything in place. And this is a part of the rocket that will periodically take quite a bit of pressure due to the ejection charge. So we want this glued in really well. And so I've run glue all the way around the edge, and I'm just going to take my finger, smooth that around. And then I'm going to take a tissue here and wipe off the outside again. Okay, and I'm going to repeat this for the other side. Now this one, we don't want to get glue down in the holes if we can avoid it. So I'm going to be a little bit more careful about my initial placement. If you've never used an ejection baffle before, the idea here is that these holes are not in direct alignment with each other. And so as the ejection charge goes off at the apogee, ideally, then the gases kind of bounce around inside this, giving them time to cool down before they reach the recovery system, and in that way prevents the streamer or the parachute from melting and removing the need for using recovery wadding. There we go. Now I've got a little bit of glue down in there, and what I can do is just take the other side of my applicator stick and just make that into a film around the inside edge. And in that way we won't be occluding anything, and we'll actually give the insides of this just a little bit of protection. There's generally not a risk of this catching fire or something anyway. Okay, so that's what we've got there, and we'll now set this aside, and when I come back our motor mount should be set enough that we can continue working on them. So this is the 18mm motor mount. The glue is still moist in there, but it's had enough time to set up so that we don't have to worry about it moving. And what we're going to do next is put a slit in this, which will allow us to place the engine clip on here. And if you note in the illustration they're showing, Rocketarium uses a little bit different setup here. So if you're familiar with SDs and many of the other rocket manufacturers, when they put the engine clip in, the forward end of the clip is usually behind the engine block. And that's used then as a measuring tool to put the engine block in from the front. What Rocketarium does is put the forward end of the clip in front of, or forward of, the engine block, and this actually gives you a stronger engine block. But it also requires you to be a little bit more precise about your measurement here. Okay, so we are going to cut a slit at 2 3/4 inches from the aft end. Okay, so I'm going to mark this first at 2 3/4. And the idea here is that this should be right at the forward edge of my thrust ring. And one of the reasons I decided to do this now is so that my glue is not completely set. All right, if you've done this right, you might feel just a little bit of resistance as your knife goes up against the engine block. If you're feeling a lot of resistance, then you're in the wrong spot, and you need to come either forward or backward a little bit. Probably forward. Okay, so now if I put this in, okay, and you can see it right there. It's got a little bit of glue on it, but that's exactly where it should be. And now from here, we're going to put on the 2 centering rings. They're both identical here, so it doesn't matter which one you use. Now these are kind of generic. Rocketarium uses the same rings for several kits, and the holes in these are for anchoring a Kevlar shock cord. Now because of the way the baffle is built on this, you can't mount the shock cord around the engine mount here. Some rockets you can, but it would be really difficult to go through the baffle this way. It can be done, because you can actually thread the shock cord through the baffle, but for this kit we're just going to go with the instructions here and not get any fancier with it. And so one of these is going to just fit over the forward end, and it will come to rest right there and hold the forward end of the clip in place. The aft ring will also fit here, and this is going to go to that 1 1/4 inch mark that we made earlier. Okay, so that'll be right there. And so that's about how it should look like when we're done. And notice there is a little notch here for the engine clip. And then what I'm going to do once I've got these in place is I will fill in those holes so that I can have a better seal between the engine mount and the rest of the airframe. Alright, so for my forward ring here, I'm just going to back the ring down a little bit and get a little bit more of my glue here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and just move this all the way around, and just like with the engine blocks, when I move this back into position, it's going to put a fillet in front of it. Okay, so here I'm just going to push this back up. I'm going to leave just a little bit of the clip exposed on the front, and then try to get this as perpendicular as I can. If you're off just a little bit, it's not a big deal. I'm going to smooth out my fillet. Okay, and then I'm going to come down and do the same thing here. In this case, I'm going to move my ring a little bit forward. Okay, and once again. Now I'm getting glue on the clip. It's not a big deal. it may or may not pop loose, but that's what the notch in the engine or in the centering ring is for anyways, to hold it in place. So this glue does not stick to metal very well, and it's not a problem if it doesn't. Okay, so now I'm going to move this back to that mark. Okay, so just to the point where I cover it. And as before here, I'm going to use my finger to smooth out the fillet. Okay, and once more I'm going to check for perpendicular. That's pretty close. Now I'm going to let this dry, but before I mount it into the body tube, I will put in fillets on the interior edges here as well. But I want to make sure that these dry in place well so I don't ruin my nice perpendicular setup there. So I'm going to set that aside. Just like the 18mm mount, my 24mm mount is mostly dry. And we're going to do the same thing here. So the first thing to do is measure. And this is going to be 3 3/4 from the aft end. So make sure I'm on the aft end here. All right, and 3 3/4 is going to be right there. And if we've made all of our other measurements correctly, that should also be right at the forward edge of our thrust ring. So I'm just going to cut in a little bit here. Yeah, and I felt the same thing. So there's a little bit of resistance against the edge facing aft, but not so much that I'm cutting into the ring. So now I can put this in just for fits, and checking down. I don't know if you can see that there, but the forward end of the clip is exactly on the forward edge of the thrust ring. So that's where it should be. All right, and once more, we're going to have our 2 centering rings here. And we're going to line up the notches, so one will go there. Now we also have this. This is going to help hold the clip in place since it's such a long clip. And so that's going to go up here to that mark we made at 1 1/4 inches. And then the other ring will fit down here, and it will go to the mark that we made at 1/4 inch. Okay, and then we just got to make sure everything's straight. Okay, and as we did before, I'm going to go ahead and just back this off a little bit. Add my glue. I keep this on my left side here. There we go. Alright, and so now I'm going to push this back up right about there. Okay. Get as perpendicular as I can, and once more smooth this out. Now this was the mark that we made to estimate where our thrust ring is. It's not actually being used to mark the centering ring, although it comes pretty close if you want to use it for that. All right, now for this one, I'm going to go ahead and back it all the way down. And the aft edge is going to be at that mark. So what I'm going to do here is glue all the way around just in front of that mark. now I'm going to slide that up until I get my mark right there. Okay, so there's my mark again. And as we did before, I'm going to go ahead and smooth out that fillet in front. And this one, it really doesn't matter if I put on a back fillet. The only thing this does is hold the clip in place. It's not going to be receiving any thrust or force or pressure. All right, and then for my aft ring here, all right, there's my mark. And so I'm going to do this just like we did the other ones. Something I've noticed making these videos, I always refer to myself as we, but actually I'm referring to us, myself and you who's watching this video. So I'm not taking on royal airs, I'm just trying to include you. Okay, now I'm going to move that up to my mark again. Way off perpendicular. That's set. Alright, and then once more. Now in this set of centering rings, there actually is a little difference between the forward and the aft one. So the aft centering ring has a bigger notch in it than the forward one does. So make sure you get that one in place at the right point. And it'll be really obvious because if you try and put the aft one up here, the clip will fall out. Okay, so I'm going to wipe off some of the excess here. All right, and once again, I'm going to let this dry and then we'll fill in the interior fillets of the centering rings once the glue is dried. While the engine mounts are still drying, we can move on to the next step here and start assembling the booster tube and get it ready for the motor mount to be installed. So this is the medium-sized white tube, and then we'll need this coupler. And the first thing to do is mark the coupler at 1 inch. And this should be the midpoint of the coupler. And then we are going to glue this into the forward end of our booster tube. So this is the aft end, it's got all the marks on it. This is just going to slip in here. And again, a good idea to dry fit before doing anything. Okay, so that'll go there. And so here I'm going to go ahead and just take some glue, put it on the inside, not up to the edge, but close. Oops, well, I got a little on the edge. Gravity still works. So I'm going to bring this around. And what we'll do is, as the coupler is pushed in, it'll push any excess glue ahead of it, and that will keep it out of the seam. Okay, so now I'm just going to place this in. And I'm going to just give it a little bit of a twist as we go in, and that helps to spread the glue better. Okay, right up until we get to that line. All right, that has to dry, but this next part, we want to think about how you're going to do this. So we need to put in now a couple of holes. And these are going to be vent holes for the gap staging system. And these are absolutely critical for this to work. So what we're going to do is measure from the end of the coupler down here to 1 1/8 of an inch. All right, and that can go right here on the launch lug line. And then we'll have another hole opposite that. And here I'm going to estimate it. It doesn't have to be exactly 180 degrees. But we do want to make sure that it is in between the fins. So I'm looking at this area here. And then once again, I'm going to put a mark here at 1 1/8 inches. And what we're going to do after the glue has dried here is drill, or you can punch, an 1/8 inch diameter hole through both sides of this. And what happens in gap staging is as the booster stage burns through its propellant, at the very end it forces some of that burning propellant forward, along with a lot of hot gases. And we want that burning material to get up into the sustainer stage, but there's also a lot of pressure involved here. And so if we don't have any vents in this, the pressure of the booster reaching its end would simply force the booster away from the rest of the rocket and not giving it time to ignite the sustainer stage. Having these holes gives just enough delay in the ejection of the booster to allow time for the burning material to get up into the sustainer and ignite that. And so these correspond to the smaller holes that are in the engine mount itself. And basically the whole thing is just a little bit of a pressure relief system that gives us just a fraction of a second, enough time to get the sustainer burning before the booster stage falls away. In preparation for drilling, I've added a layer of masking tape around here, and this is just to help keep the edges of the hole from fraying quite so badly as I drill through it. Alright, I've got a 1/8 inch drill bit in here, and I'm going to hold this so that I make sure my finger is not behind it there, and just give it a couple of revs. So there's one. I'm going to do the same thing here. Okay, that took a little bit longer. It seemed, I think my drill bit's a little bit dull. That's okay. So now I can take this off gently. Okay, and we've got, it's raised just a little bit on here, but not very much. And I'm probably not even going to worry about it too much, but if you want, you can sand that down. I would recommend doing that after priming the tube for painting though, because the primer will help make the edges here a little bit more rigid, and that way you can sand them without getting a lot of fraying. Here I've applied the inner fillets to my centering rings on both of the engine mounts here. So this is the 18 millimeter. Right, and on the 18 I've filled in the two holes there, and I just need to do that on this one. So fill that hole. And that one does not have one. Okay. So the rear or aft centering ring on the 24 millimeter mount does not have that little hole in it. So I just need to fill those in. And we're going to set these aside to continue drying. And in the meantime, the next thing we can do in preparation for assembly of everything is to mount the launch lugs to the standoffs. So these Both of these parts are in the small parts bag, and so we simply have this small piece of balsa, and we're going to glue the wide face of that to the launch lug like this. And we'll do that twice. There are two of them. So here I'm just going to put a layer of glue on. And I'm just going to put that directly on there. Okay, now here I want to make sure that I'm centered, or it may make movement of the rocket over the launch rod difficult. Smooth out the excess. We'll put real fillets on this later after it's been mounted to the rocket. Alright, so now I'm just going to look straight on there. Okay. So that one we'll set aside to dry, and simply do the same thing on the second one. And one thing you need to be careful of is to keep glue out of the ends of that launch lug. We don't want any glue getting on the inside. Okay, now once again we want to make sure we're centered on here. Okay, again, smooth that out, make sure I don't have anything on the bottom. And that one can dry. And at this point, we simply have to take a little bit of a break here and make sure all the glue is dry. One of the things that can be done while we're waiting for the glue to dry is to prepare the fins before we mount them. And according to the instructions, they want us to have rounded or knife-edged leading edges, but then to leave the other edges squared off. And this is going to be mainly a matter of taste here. So there's certainly no reason why you couldn't airfoil the entire thing. I actually prefer to leave square edges on the actual fin edge and on the trailing edge here, mainly for strength. Now if you're trying to break altitude records and things like that, then yeah, go ahead and do a full airfoil there. Now be particularly careful. These are the booster stage fins, and because they are so narrow and the grain is going parallel with the leading edge, but there's not a whole lot of difference between the leading edge and the trailing edge here, and this is going to make these really flexible, even though it's fairly thick balsa. So as you're sanding these, be really careful that you don't put too much pressure and end up snapping a fin. The sustainer stage fins are more robust, but you'll sand those in the same way. Go ahead and rounding off the leading edge, and then the kit recommends leaving the rest of the edges squared off. After you've got this done, you'll need to decide how you want to prepare your fins. I prefer to do some sanding sealer on the fin and before I mount it, because it's a whole lot easier to do nice smooth sanding when you can still manipulate the entire fin without it attached to the rocket. Another possibility, if you want to try it, is what's called papering of fins. And this is where you take just some regular printer or copy paper and laminate that onto the balsa fin. And this gives you the paper smoothness without having to go through the process of sanding sealer and sanding and multiple coats and things like that. It also strengthens the fins here. Now I'm not going to go through the whole process with this, and this is a different rocket. This is not the Super Chief here. But if you want to learn how to do this, the Apogee Components website has a really good video on papering fins. And then last, if you just don't want to do anything because you're in a really big hurry, yeah, you can put them on without any preparation, but the grain of the wood will show through the paint. And the only way to get rid of that then is to put on multiple layers of primer and do a lot of sanding with the fins attached. And as I said, that's the hardest part to do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use regular old sanding sealer on my fins for this rocket. And so I'm going to let that, excuse me, I'm going to do that and let them dry, and by the time I get that done, we should be ready to put the motor mounts into the body tubes. Alright, we're ready to put the engine mount here into our booster stage. Now you can still see that the glue here is not completely dry, but it is set and it's not going to go anywhere, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. Now when we get to the end of this, we want the holes here lined up fairly closely to the holes here. If you're off a little bit, it's not a big deal, but we don't want them perpendicular or something like that. So I'm going to dry fit this first of all. It is pretty snug. And this is going to have to go in far enough so that the end of the engine tube is flush with the body tube. Okay, so that's going to be kind of snug there. That's alright. So when this is fully inserted, it should look like that. I'm going to take my ruler here and make sure that it is all flush. Okay, and this is necessary in order for the other end to properly couple with the sustainer. So here you can see the two holes there are not quite exactly, but they're pretty close. And so when I put this in for real, I will just make sure to move them over just a bit. Okay. So the way we're going to do this is to apply some glue. Alright, so according to the instructions, 3.5 inches from the aft end. And you can mark this with a pencil like we did before with the engine mount tube. Or what I'm going to do here is take one of my applicators again and mark it . Okay, so this is the actual applicator that came with the kit this time. And what I'm going to do is just take my ruler here and find out where 3.5 inches are going to be. Mark that right there. And now when I put the glue in, I will know where to actually allow this to come up in contact with the tube. So once again, I'm just going to take some glue here. Alright, and try to keep it mostly right on the end. And I'll just insert this now and then bring it up against the inside of the body tube. Okay, now I'm going to do this again. Check down inside. That's a little bit right there. Flip it over and get all the glue in there. Okay, so I've got glue pretty evenly placed around in there. Okay, you kind of see it there. Now when I put this in, I'm not going to insert it fully right away. So I'm going to, first of all, turn this so I can line it up with the launch lug line. So the launch lug line here with one of our holes, I've got the engine tube hole in line with that. All right, now I'm not going to push this all the way up yet, because now what I'm going to do is tilt this as much as I can. Don't want to break it. But now I'm going to place some glue right inside the edge. And the aft centering ring will go through this glue, and that will glue it into place. Pop it over the other side. And do the same thing here around. Okay, a little bit of a gap on that side. Put some glue there. Alright. So now I'm going to check down here once more. Make sure my holes are more or less lined up. Alright, now I'm going to push this in. Okay, and I've hit that first ring of glue. Now we've got to be fairly quick here because the glue is going to bind. It's doing so already, so I'm going to use the handle of my hobby knife here to push it in. Okay, and I'm going to pull that back. Too far. Okay, and again I want that flush. So I can check that with my ruler here. Alright, so flush with the motor tube, not flush with the hook. Alright, now I'm going to check my other side, and my holes are really close to where they would be ideally. Okay. And I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but I can just see down to the forward centering ring there, and it's got a good bead of glue all the way around it. Okay, and this side looks good as well. If you want, you can put a bead of glue around the inside there. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm just going to smooth it all out using this applicator here. Really don't want a whole bunch of blobs of excess glue down here. Alright, but that should hold everything in place now. Okay, and I'm just going to release the clip a little bit so if any glue is stuck to that, it's not going to try and adhere permanently. Okay, so this part now can be left to dry, and let this dry completely before you do any more to this tube. So we won't worry about the fins and such until that glue is completely dried. And the fins which have been sanding sealed, those are drying as well. So everything should get done at about the same time, and then we can move on to installing the fins. Now for the sustainer mount, we need to mark it at 3/16 of an inch. Which is going to be about there. Okay, and no more than that amount can stick out from the sustainer stage when we put that in. So here, this is going to go in the aft end. And again, I'm going to dry fit this first. Okay, we got a little bit snugness there. One of the things you can do here is take your thumbnail and just kind of chamfer this outward just a little bit. Now we can try it. There, that was enough. If that still doesn't give you enough room to move this in easily, then you can sand off the edges of the centering rings a little bit. Alright, so here, so that's how far we need this to stick out, and this is so that the two stages will mate correctly inside the booster stage so that the gap staging can occur correctly. Now in this case we need the glue at 2.5 rather than 3.5 inches. I'm going to go ahead and use my same applicator here. I'm just going to wipe off that excess glue for a moment. And then make a marking here at 2.5 inches. Okay, and then I'm going to do this the same way. So I'm going to move this in. Again, making sure you're in the aft end. And now I'm just going to place a ring of glue here all around the inside circumference. That looks pretty good. And then just like we did before, we're going to put this in. I'm going to move it off to the side a little bit. And we'll put another ring of glue just inside here. Now in this case it doesn't matter what the orientation of the engine mount is because we don't have to line up any vent holes. I am going to orient it so that my engine mount clip is between a fin and a launch lug, but other than that, we just need to pop that in. Okay, I'm going to move it forward. Again, you want to do this fairly quickly so the glue does not bind and lock in the wrong place. And there we go. Okay, and we look down here. Everything looks good there. And again, I'm going to go ahead and apply a thin fillet down here. Most of this I'm going to have to scrape back out. That's okay. Now, because of the need for the coupler to fit in here, I want to make sure that I don't leave a lot of glue residue behind. So once I've got that fillet filled in here, I'll scrape the rest of that out. And I may even have to sand that just a little bit, but not until it's completely dry. Okay. Now I'm just going to take some tissue here and use it to wipe around. Again, try to remove as much excess glue as I can, because we don't want this so thick that the coupler won't disengage when it stages. Alright, so I'm going to leave this to dry as well. And at this point, this is going to take several hours. So this is a good time to go make your dinner or mow the lawn or something. And when we come back, we will put on the launch lugs and the fins.